Nuclear war is a terrifying topic that often gets swept under the rug, but it's one we can't ignore. The idea of an all-out nuclear conflict is something that, for most, seems like a distant nightmare. However, the devastating effects of such a war are not just limited to immediate explosions and deaths. In fact, there's a much bigger picture to consider, one that could dramatically change the entire world. This scenario isn't just about cities being reduced to rubble, it's about what happens after. What if a nuclear war could actually freeze the planet? Could this happen, and what would that mean for the future of humanity? To understand this, we need to first think about the immediate effects of a nuclear war. A single nuclear bomb is more than enough to cause immense destruction. The blast wave and the thermal radiation would incinerate everything in its path, leaving nothing behind but a charred wasteland. If multiple bombs were to explode, the scale of devastation would be beyond anything we could imagine. Cities would be leveled, entire populations wiped out, and infrastructures obliterated. The world would be thrown into chaos, with survivors trying to make sense of the destruction. But the story doesn't end there. The real threat to life on Earth could come from the environmental fallout. As the bombs explode, they would release a huge amount of radioactive particles into the atmosphere, along with ash, soot, and other pollutants. The sky would be covered in a thick, choking cloud, blocking out the sun. This would cause temperatures to drop rapidly, and what's known as a nuclear winter would begin. This is a scenario where the Earth's temperatures plummet dramatically, potentially freezing large portions of the planet. How could this happen? Well, it's a simple matter of the sun being blocked by the debris in the air. The thick cloud of ash and soot from the nuclear explosions would prevent sunlight from reaching the Earth's surface. Without the sun's warmth, temperatures could drop by as much as several degrees in just a few days. And while that may not sound like much, this drop in temperature could have disastrous effects. Plant life would die off due to the lack of sunlight, and crops would fail, leading to widespread famine. The ecosystems that rely on these plants would be severely disrupted, and the ripple effect would continue through every level of the food chain. But just how cold would it get? Experts believe that a nuclear winter could cause global temperatures to drop by as much as 10 degrees Celsius, about 18 degrees Fahrenheit. This might not seem like much, but it would be enough to bring about a global crisis. Places that are already cold would become even colder, and regions that are typically temperate could experience snow and frost year-round. The planet would be plunged into a freezing, uninhabitable state, and survival would become nearly impossible for most forms of life, including humans. It's not just the cold that would make life unbearable. The air itself would be polluted, filled with radioactive particles and toxic chemicals. Breathing would become difficult, and the very air would pose a lethal threat to anyone caught outside. It would be hard to find food, water, or any shelter from the cold and the radiation. Survivors would face a new kind of challenge. Not only would they be fighting to stay alive in a world that's turned dark and frozen, but the very air they breathe could be deadly. So while a nuclear war might not literally freeze the entire planet solid, the effects of a nuclear winter could bring about extreme, life-threatening conditions. It's a chilling thought to imagine the entire world shrouded in darkness, cold, and despair. In the next part, we'll dive deeper into the long-term environmental effects of nuclear war and explore what would happen to the planet's ecosystems and human survival in a world where nothing seems to grow and everything is covered in radioactive dust. As the nuclear war rages on, the world would be left reeling from the immediate devastation, but the true horror would be found in the long-term effects on the planet's ecosystems. With the sun blocked by a thick layer of smoke, ash, and soot, it wouldn't just be a temporary chill that people would be dealing with. The entire planet's environment would be irrevocably changed. The sky would be dark, casting everything in an eerie, perpetual twilight. Without sunlight, the growing season for plants would end, leading to crop failures all around the world. In a matter of weeks, agriculture would become nearly impossible. The temperature drops and lack of sunlight would decimate crops in fields, while plants in forests and jungles would wither and die. Even the hardiest species, adapted to extreme conditions, would struggle to survive. The ecosystems that we rely on would begin to collapse, starting with the plants that feed everything else. This sudden disruption in the food chain would have devastating effects on all living creatures, from small insects to large mammals and humans. Entire species could go extinct, unable to adapt quickly enough to the harsh conditions that followed the war. As temperatures plummeted, it would become increasingly difficult for humans to grow food. People would turn to what little they could find, but the destruction of farming and the contamination of the air and water would make it nearly impossible to feed the world's population. A global food crisis would take hold, and nations would struggle to provide basic necessities. Starvation would become a major concern, as food would be scarce, and the little that remained would likely be tainted with radiation. The loss of biodiversity would leave the planet's ecosystems fragile, unable to recover quickly from the damage that had been done. But it isn't just plants and animals that would suffer. The radioactive fallout from the nuclear explosions would spread far and wide, contaminating everything it touched. Water sources would become unsafe to drink, as rivers, lakes, and even the oceans would become polluted with radioactive materials. Fish and other marine life would be killed off, further disrupting the food chain and making it difficult for any kind of life to thrive. The air would be thick with dangerous particles, and breathing in these toxic fumes would have devastating consequences for human health. Cancer rates would rise sharply, and people would suffer from radiation poisoning, making survival even harder for those who managed to survive the initial bomb blasts. The long-term effects on the environment and human health would be felt for generations. The radiation wouldn't just disappear overnight. It would linger in the environment for years, possibly even centuries, making it difficult, if not impossible, for life to return to normal. Soil would be poisoned, crops would remain unable to grow, and even the most basic survival needs would be hard to meet. Those who survived would face a world that had been irreparably changed. The future of humanity would depend on how well people could adapt to this new, harsh world, and whether they could find a way to rebuild amidst the chaos. But rebuilding wouldn't be easy. The collapse of human society would create another set of challenges. Without functioning governments, infrastructure, or economies, people would be left to fend for themselves. Lawlessness could take hold, and the world could descend into anarchy as people fought for limited resources. Communities would break down, and survival would become the main priority. Nations that were once powerful and influential would be reduced to ruins, and the global order would crumble. The world would be thrown back into a time where the survival was the only thing that mattered, and human civilization would have to start over from scratch. The psychological toll would be immense. People who survived the destruction would be left to live in a broken world, without the comforts and technologies they once took for granted. Fear, distrust, and despair would permeate every corner of society. With the constant threat of death looming and the world struggling to rebuild, it's hard to imagine what the future would look like. The environmental destruction would make it nearly impossible to return to the world as it once was. Humanity's future would be uncertain, and it would be up to the survivors to figure out how to adapt, rebuild, and survive in a world that had been turned upside down. In the face of all this, we must consider how we would deal with the ongoing environmental and societal collapse in the aftermath of nuclear war, and whether we could truly rebuild from the ashes. As the world continues to grapple with the fallout from nuclear war, it's not just the environmental damage or the collapse of society that would pose a problem. The nuclear winter, caused by the massive amounts of soot and debris launched into the atmosphere, would create a dramatic shift in the climate, with temperatures dropping globally. This nuclear winter would be a severe cooling effect, and it wouldn't just last for days or weeks. Experts suggest it could last for several years, plunging the Earth into an ice age-like scenario. The drop in temperature would be severe enough to freeze lakes, rivers, and even parts of the oceans. In places where ice sheets hadn't formed in centuries, they would become a new reality. The global cooling would make it nearly impossible to grow food in most areas, especially in regions that relied on temperate climates to sustain their agriculture. Crops that once thrived in warm or moderate temperatures would be unable to survive in the freezing conditions that would result from the widespread soot and ash cloud. The oceans, already affected by the radiation, would become even less hospitable. Marine life would suffer as the cold temperatures slow down ocean currents, making it harder for fish and other marine creatures to survive. This would worsen the global food crisis, as fishing industries would be decimated and ocean ecosystems would collapse. With the collapse of marine life, those who depend on seafood for sustenance would find their food sources shrinking, and countries that rely on ocean trade would see their economies come to a standstill. This global breakdown of the food chain would lead to widespread malnutrition, famine, and loss of life across the globe. But it's not just the cold and the lack of food that people would have to worry about. With much of the Earth's surface irradiated, the landscape would be a hostile place. The radioactive fallout would spread across the land, poisoning the soil, making it unfit for farming or any kind of sustainable agriculture. Even if people did manage to grow food, the radiation in the soil would seep into the plants, tainting the food supply. What little life remained would be under constant threat from radiation exposure, which would also affect the health of any survivors. Children, in particular, would suffer from the genetic mutations caused by radiation, and generations to come would be born with defects or illnesses that could lead to a future population crisis. The lack of infrastructure would mean that even basic needs would be incredibly hard to meet. Hospitals, if they still existed, would be overwhelmed with the sick and injured, and the medical supplies needed to treat radiation sickness would be in short supply. Governments overwhelmed by the scale of the catastrophe would struggle to provide any meaningful aid to the population. In a world without functioning systems of law or order, the struggle for survival would turn brutal. With widespread famine, disease, and lawlessness, some may turn to violence to secure the resources they need. Communities would break down with self-preservation taking precedence over cooperation. The fight for the last remaining food, water, and shelter would shape the new world, and what was once a global community would be reduced to fragmented, desperate groups. People would no longer be able to rely on the systems and technologies that once kept society running smoothly. Power plants would be inoperable, communication systems would be down, and transportation networks would grind to a halt. Without electricity, modern conveniences would be gone, and people would have to return to a pre-industrial way of life, living off whatever resources they could scavenge. The loss of communication would isolate individuals and communities, making it even harder to work together in the face of such widespread chaos. The technological world as we know it would be gone, replaced by a grim struggle for survival. As the cold deepens and the landscape becomes even more hostile, the survivors would face a bleak future. Life as we know it would be irrevocably altered, and the question of whether humanity could ever recover would hang over everything. Would the survivors rebuild, or would humanity fade away in the face of such overwhelming challenges? The long-term effects on our planet and society would be staggering, and it would take generations, if not centuries, to even begin to repair the damage done. Whether or not life on Earth could ever return to what it once was would depend on how well the survivors could adapt and whether humanity could avoid repeating the mistakes that led to such a catastrophic event. In the aftermath of a nuclear war, the damage would continue to unfold in ways that are hard to fully comprehend. As time passed, the Earth would slowly begin to recover, but the scars of the conflict would remain. The ecological balance would be irrevocably altered, and rebuilding civilization would seem like an impossible task. The survival of humanity would be the top priority, but the very idea of rebuilding from such widespread destruction would seem almost beyond reach. One of the most crucial factors in the aftermath of nuclear war would be the survival of the environment. The extinction of many species would be a real possibility, as the radioactive contamination would permeate the land, water, and atmosphere for generations. Even once the radiation levels began to decrease, the long-term effects would linger. Ecosystems would take decades, if not centuries, to stabilize. The soil, poisoned by radiation, would make it difficult for plant life to grow. Even in areas where life would begin to return, it would be a long, slow process before the Earth could support a vibrant ecosystem again. Forests, once full of life, would be reduced to barren landscapes. Wildlife that managed to survive the initial onslaught would struggle in the harsh new conditions, and many would become extinct due to the lack of food or the radioactive environment. The genetic damage caused by radiation exposure would continue to affect future generations. People born into the post-nuclear world would face health issues like weakened immune systems, birth defects, and an increased susceptibility to diseases. The human race itself would be altered by the lingering radiation, with survival becoming more difficult as genetic mutations became more widespread. Some of these mutations could lead to diseases that would further devastate the already weakened population. The question of whether humanity could recover from such long-lasting effects would be a matter of survival for future generations. Could humanity adapt to its new environment, or would it slowly fade away under the pressure of these compounded struggles? The physical environment, of course, would be far from the only thing in need of repair. The collapse of global infrastructure would present another nearly insurmountable challenge. The loss of electricity, communication, and transportation would have long-lasting effects on survivors. Cities, once hubs of activity and civilization, would be reduced to rubble. The complex systems that supported life as we knew it, systems that brought food, medicine, and supplies to every corner of the Earth, would be gone. Rebuilding these systems would be a monumental task. Without the technological know-how and resources, it would be nearly impossible to restore the global networks that made life so interconnected. The knowledge of how to run power plants, factories, and other vital infrastructures would be lost. The people who survived would have to rely on primitive tools, relying on hard labor and ingenuity to rebuild their homes and communities. As the years stretched on, the question of whether humanity could even begin to restore civilization would be one that weighed heavily on the survivors. Even if the nuclear winter began to lift and the Earth began to warm again, humanity would face the challenge of rebuilding from the ground up. With much of the world's knowledge lost, it would be up to future generations to piece together what was left and make a new world from the ashes of the old one. The devastation caused by nuclear war would leave deep emotional scars. The trauma of seeing loved ones perish, losing everything, and living in a world of constant fear and uncertainty would shape the survivors in ways that would last for generations. The psychological impact would be as profound as the physical damage. The world would likely descend into a new kind of darkness, not just due to the lack of sunlight, but because of the deep sense of loss and the haunting realization that humanity had brought about its own destruction. It would take years, perhaps centuries, for survivors to heal, and the scars of the nuclear war would affect every aspect of life. As humanity struggled to survive, one thing would become clear. The effects of a nuclear war would be far-reaching, and the consequences would echo throughout history. The hope for recovery would be dependent on the ability of humanity to come together to rebuild in the face of unimaginable hardship. The fight for survival would be a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, but it would also be a stark reminder of the dangers that lie ahead if we fail to act responsibly in our pursuit of power. In the end, the question of whether the planet could be frozen or permanently altered by a nuclear war may not have a simple answer, but the answer would ultimately depend on the ability of humanity to learn from past mistakes and create a future that safeguards our world from such destruction. Only through cooperation, resilience, and an unwavering commitment to peace can we avoid the darkest outcome of all, a world where nuclear war becomes our legacy.